if you're tuning in on the phone, you'll just be tuning in and listening to us, and if you're on your computer, you'll be able to see the slideshow. But no worries, for this presentation, Building a Space for Rest, you will also receive the recording via email sometime this week. So if you're on the computer, you're able to ask us questions during the webinar. We'll have a time at the end. And this webinar is so popular, and we added 10 minutes to the end of it. So if you're able to stay on, we'll have a little extra time for questions. So on that little control panel, if you're on your computer, it says Go to Webinar Control Panel. And there's a place, if you scroll down, that says Questions. And if you go in there, you should be able to ask a question. So I'm going to just test it out with everybody. If you are on the line, if you can tell me where you're calling in from, and just type your answer. It says Type Answer here. Go ahead and type that in if you can, so I know that you can hear us. Okay, there we go. Look at that. Okay, we've got Guelph, Ontario, Gabriola Island, British Columbia, Calgary. Wow, you know, we've got Canada representing very well here. Long Island, Detroit, Baltimore, Asheville, another BC person, Akron, Ohio, Montreal, Denver, someone from Mexico, fantastic, Silver Springs, Maryland. See if anybody else getting the hang of it here. Arlington, Virginia. That is just so great. Well, keep typing those in, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. So just a quick, before we introduce Adam and get started here, just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Anthroposophical Society in case you've never heard of anthroposophy or the Anthroposophical Society. We've got all kinds of folks on the call tonight. Anthroposophical Society, anthroposophy is the wellspring for all of these amazing movements we have here in the country: Waldorf education, biodynamic farming, anthroposophical medicine. And so if you're interested in finding out more and joining some of our programs, Introduction to Anthroposophy, Inner Work and Biography, all of those things, you can come to our website and become a member of this society. And when you get an email after this webinar, you'll see a link there to us, so how to reach us. And now I'll turn it over to Beverly so you can say a little something.
Certainly. Before I say something, Laura, I just noticed you're a little echoey, and I'm assuming that's going to go away once you and I are both on mute when Adam is talking. But it wasn't happening when we were demoing, but just thought I'd mention it so we can keep an eye on that. But I'm Beverly Amico, the Executive Director of Advancement for ASNA. I know some of the names of you calling in, and we just really appreciate you being on for our fifth webinar that's been co-hosted with the Anthroposophical Society. So thank you for being here, and we're very excited to have Adam. So I'll just turn it over to you, Laura.
Okay, great. Well, yes, thank you so much for joining us, Adam. It's just wonderful that you're with us today. And, you know, my experience working with you, it's just amazing to have such a warm presence, so much knowledge, and I'm just so glad to dive in. And not only do you consult with Waldorf schools, also you direct the training for anthroposophical doctors. And so, you know, so if you have a doctor in your community and you want them to just get, you know, absorb this information and start bringing it to your schools, Adam is the person to talk to, actually. So thank you again, and I'm just going to turn the webinar over to you. And Beverly and I will say goodbye for now, and we'll see you at the end. Okay.
All right. Sounds great. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Beverly. It's a pleasure to be able to speak a little bit about how we can find ways to assist young children in really finding an independent ability to be soothing, to be more oriented, to be gaining tools for how they want to be active in the world, not just going to sleep, although sleep is going to be one of our major focuses for tonight. And I'm happy to be doing this webinar tonight. It's actually a topic that I've talked about with doctors who are learning about working with young children. We did that about 2.5 weeks ago. And then about 2 weeks ago, I was up in the Northwest doing a conference for early childhood teachers. And so this is now the third sort of version of some of this material. So I hope that it has some polish to it, and that you will also walk away with some applicable, practical tools by the end of our hour together. And we will have lots of time for question and answer at the end. I think the presentation will probably take 30, 35 minutes. If we need to stop for some questions along the way, maybe a little bit longer. But we're going to go through sort of a progression. And I think a really important question to ask right at the beginning is to say, what tools do we have to calm ourselves in a sometimes chaotic and unpredictable world? Certainly that's an experience of a lot of people right now, is not quite sure where their moorings are. And so we may be asking this question of ourselves. And so here are just some possible answers. One is that when we find that things are chaotic or unpredictable, we can always turn to friends and to loved ones, people that we trust. That's a really important and rich resource that we should not forget. And in some way, that's the community that we're trying to build tonight, being together on this webinar. Another option is chocolate, or ice cream, or chocolate ice cream, or pistachio ice cream, or whatever is your particular flavor of the day. But that's another way, very nice way, to give ourselves a little bit of soothing, to treat ourselves a little bit when we're in this situation. Another possibility is exercise. That a lot of people find it's a good activity for releasing stress, for getting centered again, working some of the kinks out. It's also been shown to be very helpful for stress reduction. We can also talk about biting fingernails. There are less clinical studies on the benefits of biting fingernails, but it's a fairly common one, and it's one that you can have with you. Yeah, so that's another option. We could also talk about a good novel, a movie, a Netflix binge, something to get your mind off of what's going on. And then something that I've asked, which is a question I posed to the doctors who were working with this material a couple weeks ago, is what do you do when you are in the waiting room of the dentist, or you're waiting for an appointment with a couples counselor, or you're standing outside of the hall just before a college final exam? And then we can think about pretty common examples of ways that we exhibit stress and try to work through stress, such as pacing, clenching our teeth, wringing our hands, bouncing our legs. Those are all pretty common and observable ways that we work with things being chaotic and unpredictable. In terms of childhood development, it can be helpful to say which of these are things that we receive from the outside, and which of them are activities or capacities that we can practice in ourselves. Another way to think about that is which are portable, which are the ones that you could take with you, because you might not have chocolate ice cream there going into a college final exam. You might not have a movie or a novel with you if you're in the middle of a scary or unpredictable situation. So what are some things that we can carry with us all of the time? And just a little background on sleep. I've been working as a consultant with Waldorf schools in the tradition of what's called a school doctor, which really means not doing physicals for people or colds or flus or scraped knees. It's really working in the tradition of trying to do classroom observations and then meeting with teachers after the observations to see what might be some of the reasons that children are having different developmental, academic, or behavioral concerns. And the first part of that job is really just sitting in a corner and quietly watching children as they're in class or interacting with each other or playing in a kindergarten, something like that. very often the questions that come up during those visits are about children who are showing signs of anxiety, or children who will resort to more provocative behaviors, where they will yell, where they will poke a neighbor, where they will disrupt the circle time with some talk about poop or something like that. But these questions about anxiety or provocative behaviors, which tend to come out when there is a transition in the activity, going from inside to outside, coming into the school day, transitioning from a meal time to a free play, things like that. Those transitions, and also that these behaviors come out a lot when there are a lot of people or when there are a lot of things going on. And something that's come pretty clearly to the fore while doing this work is that many of these children who experience situational anxiety also have trouble falling asleep. And sometimes I've learned that from talking with the teachers from the classroom. Sometimes it's from seeing one of the children in my practice. But it's not 100%, but a pretty good correlation between those two situations, between being a little overwhelmed or disoriented and having trouble falling asleep at night. So we can ask, what do we do when we go to sleep? It should be easy, right? We stop doing other things. But it's not quite that simple, because one of the main tasks that we have to do is to let go of our sensing of the world around us. If you think about the amount of space and activity that you are taking in consciously as maybe a bubble, that bubble has to get smaller. Making that bubble smaller is a lot harder if we are in a new place, mostly because there are lots of new things to notice and keep track of. If you're in a familiar setting, then things are a little bit boring and you don't need to be keeping track of them quite so much. Or if things are very predictable and it's going exactly the way it usually does each day, then you don't have to keep track as closely either. But new places are difficult. This process of releasing the outside world can be a lot more challenging if there is stimulus that keeps pulling our attention back to the outside world. So if there's traffic noise, street lights shining in through the window, if the temperature is too cold or too hot, then that ability to really release from the outside can be blocked. Recently, when I was speaking at a conference, someone was asking me about, could this be part of the appeal of a sensory deprivation chamber? You know, one where you're floating in concentrated salt water and it's black and there's no noise. And that maybe that allows us to really go to this deep state of relaxation that we don't encounter on an everyday basis. It is true that there are some people who are able to fall asleep as soon as their heads hit the pillow, but that's certainly not the majority of people that I know or the majority of people that I talk to. Most people, there's a progression. And so out of this, we can put as a hypothesis, a pretty firm hypothesis, that learning to fall asleep is an acquired skill, even for children. So a question is, what is the first and foremost way we learn to soothe and sleep? And this is a nice picture of an infant. And you might have all kinds of different answers for this, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to start with taste. And maybe some reasoning for that is that you can breastfeed an infant and she will go right to sleep. Of course, there's more happening than just taste, but taste is a primary element in breastfeeding or in bottle feeding. And in fact, with a newborn, it can be a challenge trying to keep the child awake long enough to really feed, to get a full feeding in. It takes them a few days or even a couple of weeks sometimes to really wake up to be able to get a full feed in. that taste puts them at such ease that they immediately go to sleep. And it is amazing to see how for a very young child, almost all wrongs can be made better by nursing. So we can think about taste as being a very innate, important, foundational way that we feel good and that we can go to sleep. But there is a certain point where the child stops automatically going to sleep when she feeds. And at about that same time, there is now a new way to soothe a child. And this is another nice picture. It might look like the baby is trying to eat the mother's face. That is not quite my intention, but it was the best picture I could gather for this particular one. But so there's this phase where the child nurses but is still awake. And there's an extra step beyond just tasting, nursing that they need to be able to soothe. And if she's upset or disoriented, he or she, I'm just speaking of an infant girl for right now, but the solution is very often to hand her to her mother. And you might say, truly, what is happening here? Just being close to mom seemingly makes everything better. And we could wonder, what is the sense activity that is helping with that connection? And we could say it's smell. It's the smell of mom. Sometimes it's the smell of breast milk on mom. But there's an immediate familiarity. And the child really feels good right away. Smell is also very innate. And actually, most of us have very strong emotional connections with smell, whether it's good or bad. But smell asks less of the outside world than taste does. Taste involves actually giving something. Smell is still just sort of in the realm of proximity. Now, there is obviously a third sensory aspect that often mingles into these encounters, into breastfeeding or into letting mom hold a child, which is touch. And being soothed by touch without taste or smell actually represents another developmental step. Because there is a point after taste and smell where the child can now be soothed by touch from someone other than the mother. This could be the father, the grandparent, the neighbor. This might represent a hug, a back rub. It could be swaddling, although usually by the time the child can be soothed in this way, they're getting a little more stronger, that they don't need quite all of that swaddling, but other kinds of touch can be comforting to them. And so what do we actually experience when we touch? That's a question that we can ask here. Here's another lovely baby, yawning and just getting ready to go to sleep. And now we're going to enter into a little bit of anthroposophy, just a little insight. This is one of my favorite things that I've really been working to understand in doing this work with small children. And this is a quote from Rudolf Steiner when he's talking about the different ways that we sense and interact with the world. And he says, when you touch objects, you actually perceive only yourself. You touch an object, and if it is hard, it presses forcibly on you. If it is soft, its pressure is only slight. You perceive nothing of the object, however. You sense only the effect upon yourself, the change in yourself. A hard object pushes your organs far back into you. You perceive this resistance as a change in your own organism when you perceive by the means of touch. So here's a pen, and when I feel that pen without looking at it, I can tell that it's hard because my fingers indent more. If I take, here's a dance slipper, if I take it and I push on the leather, that is soft, and my fingers indent less. Usually when we think about touch, we experience it as a way, or we orient it as a way that we go out into the outside world and see what is happening there. But really, touch is a way that we feel ourselves on a very important foundational level. And so as children go through this soothing progression, when they come to touch, they are receiving the touch from outside, but on an important level, they are learning to actually feel themselves. When we give a child a hug, it's not just that we're loving the child or reassuring them, we're actually helping them feel themselves in themselves, maybe after they've scraped a knee, something like that. So this comes from a lecture series titled Spiritual Science is a Foundation for Social Forms. A very interesting series where Steiner is talking about different ways that there can be social health. And in the middle of this, he puts this lecture about all of the different sense capacities that the human being has. And so this is a representation of what he puts in that lecture. Looks a little bit busy. We're not going to worry about all of that. But we just want to point out, or I'd like to point out, that if we go over here to the upper right, number 6, sense of vision. Vision is a very neutral sense. I can decide to look at something in more depth. I can see it and dismiss it. I'm not committing myself a whole lot through my sense of vision, which is good because I look at probably 10,000 things in a day. When I taste something, when I take a drink of water, I'm taking substance into myself. And I don't have so much choice about whether I pay attention to it or not. It's not such a flexible sense, a non-committal sense. It's already inward. And it's starting to mingle with my own juices, my own saliva, when I taste something. If we go down to number 8 now, the sense of smell. Smell is even more inward. I can sip a glass of water. I can't sip a smell. When I smell something, it's really a strong experience. And again, these very visceral emotions or memories that can be associated with smell. And then we come to the sense of touch. And with touch, I'm actually feeling myself. And then if we move through this progression to 10, 11, and 12, in this lecture, it's talked about the sense of balance, which is really our vestibular sense, how we know whether we're moving or not. If you're on an elevator or an escalator and you can tell that you're moving, that's through the sense of balance, not just the balance that we have when we're on a trampoline or a walkway or things like that. And then number 11, the sense of movement, is really our own sensing that we are moving in space. And this has to do with the sense of proprioception. So if I close my eyes and hold up my arm, I know where my arm is in space, not because I'm looking at it, but because I have sense organs in my joints, in my muscles. And then at the very most inner place, we have what's called the sense of life, which is really my inner sensing of how I am doing outside of the outside world. Regardless of the outside world, I'm really sensing my own inner health. So we've talked about sense of taste, sense of smell, sense of touch as the first part of this progression. In following this sequence, we can see some important patterns. As we just said, we go from vision to taste to smell to touch. I've got a little typo there, but then to the sense of balance, to the sense of self-movement, of sensing myself in movement, to the sense of life. So vision to taste to smell to touch to balance to movement to life. And this is in many ways the progression that we have to chart whenever we need to calm and orient ourselves. This represents an archetypal progression. And we can observe that as a child becomes more mobile, more independent in his movement, he moves more and more into these senses and experience of touch, balance, and movement. So as the child becomes older, as the child starts to crawl, as the child starts to walk, as the child starts to run and jump, they are moving more and more into these experiences of touch, balance, and movement. And that as the child becomes more actively involved in sensing, the child ultimately also needs to become more capable in soothing himself. There's a reciprocal relationship here that if I'm moving more and more actively out into the outer world through my movement, that I need to be able to feel more calm and more secure in myself. It's a lot like when a child crawls away from the mom and then comes back. Those loops get bigger. And sometimes you'll even see the child go away and then look back for some reassurance that things are good, and then decide to go a little bit further. They're taking these steps, developmental steps, further and further away. All right, so there's that figure again, going from sense of vision at 6 to taste, to smell, to touch, to balance, to movement, to life. Let's talk a little bit more about the sense of life specifically with this picture of a very happy little person. From the same lecture, when the sense of life is described, it's said in this way: when do we enter the most into ourselves? When within the general feeling of life, we perceive what we always have as our consciousness in the waking condition. When we perceive that we are. When we experience ourselves inwardly. When we sense that we are we. All this is mediated by the life sense. So when you're connected to your life sense, you can just feel that you are yourself, and you feel good in that place. This comes from this same lecture. And in other places, Steiner described the sense of life as really being our experience of well-being. When the life sense is in balance, then we feel good. In fact, we may not be aware that we have a sense of life until it is imbalanced. If we're hungry, if we're tired, if we're nauseated, those kinds of things, we can feel that our inner world is off, but really the life sense is this place we come to feel good about what we're doing. So the question comes, do we as adults use this pathway to calm and orient ourselves? And the answer is yes, of course. And this list may look familiar. It's the one we saw at the beginning. What do we do to calm and orient ourselves? We rely on friends and loved ones, people that we trust. So we still need this connection to the outside world. And that's a really important way that we orient and calm ourselves. But it's not very portable all of the time. We could talk about chocolate or ice cream, or chocolate ice cream. And this is interesting because this actually relates to that sense of taste, which is quite early and innate, but it's quite early on the spectrum of how we go into the life sense. And during a holiday as a treat to ourselves, it's lovely to use the sense of taste to feel good and oriented. But obviously, we don't want to depend on having to taste something all of the time in order to feel good. We could talk about exercise, where we're invoking the senses of touch, balance, and movement. We could talk about biting fingernails, which in many ways is a touch experience. It's a touch experience of the fingers, it's a touch experience of the teeth, of the tongue, of the mouth. Again, it's true that a good novel, a movie, or a Netflix binge, these are all great outer balms, but these connect more to the vision sense. And I just want to say a little bit here that there's this very strong tendency that when small children feel nervous, or adults feel nervous, I can catch myself doing this with a cell phone, that if I am bored, it's easy to pop the phone on or hand the screen to a child and say, here, occupy yourself for a little bit. The challenge being the vision sense is way out there. It's not really sensing ourselves. And that when a child does not practice that inward pathway and relies on those outer visual experiences to orient and calm them over and over, then this pathway becomes unpracticed. And I think that contributes in a very real way to problems with anxiety or restlessness later. We can have this question, what do you do when you're in the waiting room of the dentist, the couples counselor, or a final exam? We pace, which invokes these senses of movement and balance. We clench, which is a touch. We may wring our hands, which is also touch. We may bounce our legs. We might wiggle back and forth. These are also touch and balance experiences. So movement in children can actually be a way for children to calm themselves. And these are very typical pediatric developmental milestones from age 3 months to 36 months, where a child at 3 months can control their head, 4 to 6 months they start rolling over, 9 months crawling, 12 months standing, by 18 months running, and 24 months jumping with 2 feet, and in that next year starting to potty train. And we can see that there's some movement that the child experiences themselves not just in touch from the outside, but they start seeking touch themselves as a way to calm and orient themselves. And it also helps a little bit with the mystery of why is it that often when you're trying to calm a child down for sleep, say you put them in a nice bath, they're all warm, they have their teeth brushed, and they're in pajamas, and then they decide it's time to run around the house. Or they want to wrestle, or things like that. Those can be true ways to get away with not doing it, to re-divert the activity. But I actually think there are a lot of situations where a child, especially if they haven't moved much during the day, is invoking these senses to try and feel in themselves. And just asking them to stop doesn't necessarily help them feel any calmer or more oriented, because they're trying to use these pathways to connect to the life sense. So how does knowing about this inner pathway help us? We can say for sure that it means that as a child gets older, he or she moves into new sensory experiences. It makes sense that as a child learns to become more independent in the outside world, that there needs to be reciprocal inner steps towards well-being, towards finding more independent ways to connect to the life sense and to our inner world. And as we move through these senses, from taste to smell to touch to balance to movement, we are less and less able to influence the sense capacity from the outside. What does that mean? Taste we can give to a child. So as the parent, it is easy to want to provide that solace. Breastfeeding is a very direct way to give that kind of solace. Smell we can also give to a child, but it's not totally dependent on us. In fact, a lot of children, as they get a little bit older and they have a favorite teddy bear or a favorite blanket, part of the reason they love that item is that it has a smell. It may smell like them. Or some of them will love to have an article that belongs to a parent that smells like the parent or like the grandparent. But taste we can give to them, smell we can provide, but smell gets a lot bigger. We can offer and participate in touch, but it is really the child's own sensing of herself that underlies the sense of touch. So we can give the opportunity, but we can't ensure whether the child feels it. We're getting to a little bit of a gray area. Balance is actually, this is from this same lecture, an experience of how we perceive the relationship of our own inner being to the world outside, within which we experience ourselves in a state of equilibrium. And this is really an inner sense for the child, how they're mediating inside and outside. We can think about balance as being a very mechanical sensing pattern, but it actually has more of this inner experience as well. And we can't make a child feel balanced from the outside. A child's sense of movement, of knowing where their limbs are or whether they are in movement, we can't give that to them. I mean, you could take a child and move their arms for them, but you can't help them create the sense. You can't just put a child in a gyroscope and make them move and it will make everything feel better. It's a capacity that they are evolving. And then the sense of life, of well-being, is completely inward. That's actually not something we can control. And by the time a child gets to be 7 or 9, this capacity for the sense of life really comes to some important thresholds where even if you are trying from the outside to make all of the situation safe and comfortable, the child feels more independent and they really have to depend on this life sense. Many children invoke senses along the way. Again, just saying we can no longer create a child's sense of well-being. They have to learn to create it themselves. And it's important that we create spaces for a child to practice this. When a child is restless, moving, rubbing, rolling, bouncing, this can actually be a sign that the child is finding ways to orient and learning ways to self-soothe. So sometimes there's a panic about, I used to be able to get this child to go to sleep by themselves, and now when they lay down, they move around all of the time, or they roll, or some children will lay in bed and bounce, or things like that. And this is actually a sign that they are trying to create some of this pathway themselves. Relating this to the process of falling asleep. So falling asleep is the time that we practice this process of self-orienting and self-soothing every day. It is our main entree to learning this capacity. It calls on the same skills we rely on whenever we are confused or overwhelmed. And when that capacity is unpracticed, it can contribute to social anxiety and provocative behaviors. Provocative behaviors really being a way to elicit outside connection to other children or adults as a way to anchor. It's a little bit like that screen, that if I don't know how to totally calm and orient myself, then I will create connection to somebody outside me to help me feel oriented. So 5 practical steps. I've taken a little longer than I thought, but it's good. 5 practical steps. First, this might be the most important of them. Whatever a child experiences in the process of falling asleep, that is what the child will naturally want to replicate whenever the child needs to go back to sleep in the middle of the night. Everybody has sleep cycles where our sleep lightens about every 90 to 150 minutes. It changes. But when a child goes to sleep and then wakes up an hour and a half or 2 hours later, that's because their sleep cycle just lightened. And if their sleep lightens and they arouse themselves and look around a little bit, they need to chart this same pathway to feel oriented and calmed. And whatever it was that helped them do this when they fell asleep, they want those same conditions in the middle of the night. It's also very common that the child wants these same conditions when they're feeling confused with transitions, because this is asking for them to call on the same capacity. or when the child is overwhelmed. So that was our first one, that whatever is happening at bedtime, the child wants to replicate that. A corollary of that is that if the child can learn over time to more independently fall asleep, then you will see that they have more calm orientation in many other situations, and they sleep better through the night too. A second is that children make many steps towards greater awareness and greater independence throughout childhood. When a child makes a step of greater awareness, some examples would be when they are 6 to 9 months and they develop stranger anxiety, or when they're in their terrible twos, which really starts off in about 18 months, they say no to everything, or they have a new sibling. Then as their consciousness, their wakefulness just got bigger, their security in themselves gets off. They're not quite sure what to do. And so often they will return to younger known ways of self-soothing. The child might want to sleep with parents again, with a younger sibling. If the baby is breastfeeding, the child might want to breastfeed again. That's sort of going back to a known way. But when we find that a child needs more and more of what used to work, it usually means the child is needing to take a step of more independent self-soothing. So in other words, if you used to be able to rock somebody for 5 minutes, and now you have to rock somebody for 35 minutes, it probably is because the child is taking this step towards needing to be a little bit more independent in their activity. And rather than just do more and more of what you've been doing before, you can still give some of that orientation and soothing, but open a space for the child to be more independent. As part of that, the role of taste. There are certain points where it is helpful for the role of taste to shift and change. A first step is to create a space between breast or bottle feeding and falling asleep. This is just allowing the taste to be there, and then letting the child nurse and keeping the child awake a little bit after they've nursed so that they can chart part of this process. If breastfeeding a child to sleep does 95% of the soothing work for the child, now you're doing 80%. You're creating a little space for the child to be calmed and relaxed by the taste, and now still go all the way into that deeper sleep, connecting to the life sense. Another step that families ask me about is night weaning. And I will say the times that are on here are meant in no way to be a prescription. They really come out of just trying to observe and see, are there times that these things sometimes unfold? Each family is going to be different. But night weaning, which really means helping the child learn to go back to sleep without tasting, can be an important next step. And many people will think about that somewhere around a year. Prolonged dependence on taste for soothing can hold back this practice of independently feeling oneself. And I've just noticed that there are some children who, when they begin walking and are really independent in their activity, seem to happily wean themselves. I'm not saying that everybody should wean at 12 or 15 months. I really think you have to look at the child and see, but it's interesting that there can be this shifting that as the child is more independent, they're ready to let go of that first step of soothing. Fourth, touch can be a very helpful part of bedtime. I think this is the part that the doctors I've been working with got most excited about. Touch can be hugging or snuggling. It can also be rustling. So I am the father of girls who are now in 5th and 7th grade. and I can say in their life that bedtime wrestling has been a joyful part of their existence. I think dads sometimes like the wrestling more than the moms, and it's important that it not become just a craziness, but that allowing a child to really feel touch, to feel pressure on their joints, can be an important way for them to calm and orient themselves. Not right before bed, but maybe as part of the process of getting into pajamas or before that. A particularly potent way, which does not get them so agitated, is to do slow, deep touch. And my favorite way to do it right now is what I call the toothpaste treatment. I don't have a child here at the moment, but I can demonstrate, which is that basically, if you imagine at the end of a tube of toothpaste that you are trying to squeeze that last little bit out, you are trying to do that kind of slow, steady pressure. I often say for children, take both of your hands, start around a bicep up near the shoulder, and with both hands, just squeeze on about a count of 5. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then move a little bit down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And work your way down the arm. When you finally get to the hand, it can just be sort of a kneading. In some children, it's very nice to just go all the way out to the fingers. There are children I've done this with in my office who are very restless, and they end up sort of a puddle on the floor. I've had comments from people that that technique makes children more calm than they've ever seen the child in their life. You can do it on both arms. If somebody's really upset, you can do arms and legs. But I think as part of getting ready for bed for somebody who's really having trouble, just this simple squeezing, it could probably take a minute or 2 minutes, can be very, very helpful. Start at the shoulders. You can also do it at the thighs and work towards the hands and feet. And for some children, once they learn to experience this, it can be a very nice way for them to feel grounded and more calm in other kinds of transition situations. Fifth, we're almost to the end here. This comes from the question of, well, these ideas sound great, but I have a 7 or 8-year-old who still won't sleep by themselves. What should I do? They get very upset if they don't have somebody laying next to them when they fall asleep. And so this relates back to the first one, which is that whatever a child needs or whatever a child experiences when they go to sleep initially, they want that repeated when their sleep lightens in the middle of the night or when they feel anxious. So a way to make bedtime a little bit easier is to take your same bedtime ritual but move it into a communal space in the house, which is often the living room or the den, and do story, do toothpaste treatment or hugging or a back rub or wrestling, do talking about the day, do cuddling, and do it in that space. And then make a time transition and also a geographic transition into the bedroom. And then what happens in the bedroom is actually fairly simple. A kiss, a hug, maybe a little verse, something very finite, so that that space is really just where the child sleeps. And it's not the space where you're reading stories, where you're talking, where you're laying with the child until they go to sleep. Give them all of that loving orientation, but then create a space where they can practice this. So this just says, do that same ritual, then shift into the bedtime, or into the bedroom. The bed becomes a place just for sleeping, not for interacting. For adults who have sleep problems, the advice is that the bedroom really becomes a place just for sleep and intimacy. It's not for reading, it's not for checking your email, it's not for watching TV. You want to create the same kind of quiet space for the child. It's a time transition and a geographic transition. And just to say that as a child moves through childhood, your job becomes not so much putting the child to sleep as helping the child know what are the predictable ways for them to start calming and orienting themselves. This is the circle of the 12 senses. Maybe on a different webinar we can talk about those top ones, 1 through 6. And so we want to go from this very close connection through taste, through smell, through touch, which is completely appropriate. But eventually we want the child to be able to practice this capacity. And I really think it's a way to empower a child, especially the deep touch. And when this transition at night can happen, I often see that other parts of anxiety or transitions become easier. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. I will happily hear what questions you have, try to give any insights. So please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Oh, Adam, thank you. I feel like we're going to have a better night tonight.
Oh, good.
You answered so many. I was like, why do my kids get so wound up right before that? Or why is it when we fall asleep in bed with my daughter, then when she wakes up in the middle of the night, she comes into our room because she wants to replicate that? Anyway, thank you.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so here I've got some questions.
Sure.
So I had one early on from Raquel, and she said, so what she understood in the beginning is that a change in surroundings can be a cause for a child to have problems going to sleep. There can be like something that happens there. So she's wondering if she's on vacation and away from home, how long could it possibly take for her daughter to adjust to the new surroundings? Now, I think you've just given us a whole bunch of tips, so maybe that will sort of answer her question on how to make that adjustment happen anywhere. So if you have these sort of habits and rhythms at home, then
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when some of these, again, you sort of switch to these are things that you do to make your child sleep as these are things that help the child know that it's time to go to sleep. If your ritual can be consistent between home and another place, then that's a signpost. That's a foundation for the child to know, okay, I know what's going on now, even if the bed or the room is different. For a lot of people, it takes a couple of nights to make that transition. Usually the first night in a new place, for many people, that's a difficult time to get a good night of sleep. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so we have some more questions rolling in here. And we have 112 people on the call right now. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. So that's amazing. So we have added 10 minutes, so we'll go to 6:10. If you can stay, that's great. And if not, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you this week, so you'll have that in your inbox. Okay, so here's another question. Do you play with the child, during the day in their bedroom, or will that take away from the sleep space, or should I move their play space out of their bedroom? So if their play area is in their bedroom, is that a shift that would need to happen?
I think that depends on the practicalities of your house, because sometimes that is the play space that's available. In terms of this process, it would be nice if the bed at least can really just be the sleeping place. If a child is encouraged to sleep or read in their bed, some children, that's going to be fine. You know, this whole process, there's some children who are never going to have a problem. And then we don't have to worry about it. It's the other situations where we need to consciously make these shifts. So if you had the option for the play space to be out in the living room or the den or next to the kitchen, something like that, I think that fits this progression a little bit better in terms of knowing which is the place where I'm actively engaging and which is the place that I'm coming into myself. Yep, that's a good idea.
Great.
A good question to think about.
Great, thank you. Okay, so here's a question about naps. So some parents prefer that their children don't take naps because it interferes with bedtime. Maybe at some point, I mean, I certainly saw that in my house. It seemed like that. Or they just want their kids to take a short one. And Gabrielle is asking you, what's the most beneficial thing to do for the child? I don't know if you can.
Right. So there are definitely children who get to a point where they're not very tired at night, and then bedtime becomes a battle. Sometimes I've had questions from teachers in classrooms about the children, or some of the children don't seem to want to go to sleep, and it's always, disruptive, which is interesting because if we think about these other senses of touch and balance and movement, some children need to roll over a bunch of times before they can go to sleep. And that might be perceived as this child is being disruptive. But it may really be the way that the child stops their big attention bubble from going out and brings it into themselves. The dog in my family, I know she's not alone in the dog world, but she has to go in a circle 3 times before she can lay down and go to sleep. I'm pretty sure that's the same kind of phenomena. For children who don't nap, I think if it's possible that there's still some quiet time, even to age 5 and 6, some quiet time, that can be a really helpful thing. I mean, even older grade school children who come home and are very tired, some children just come home and melt down. It's nice if they can find a way. I mean, usually they need a snack. They're often hungry, so that's a sense of taste thing. But it's not bad for children to have a little space where they just experience, I've been so full of everything that's been happening during the day, how can I come in? So nap is not an absolute, but that quiet time is pretty healthy if it can still be in there.
Okay, great. Okay, so yes, we have a few more here. Okay, this one's very close to me actually because I have a big reader, my eldest. And so Sarah is saying that her 9-year-old spends a lot of time reading books, and they joke that he eats words actually, but which is interesting. Should she be concerned that he's relying too much on his vision sense for soothing, and perhaps should encourage him to be more physical? He doesn't really prefer to do a lot of physical activities, exactly how my eldest is, the same way. So wondering about that.
Yeah, a little encouragement is not bad. Reading is such a beautiful way to orient and escape from the world. It is an outer sense, so it's a really important way to be developing different thought capacities. I would say, though, if you have the sense that it's becoming a little bit of an anchor, if children, every time they need to go somewhere, they need to have a book with them. Every time you're going to ride in the car, they need to have a book with them. Then gently encouraging them to just say, okay, that was a great reading time, but now it's time to do something else. And asking them to be more physically active, to sort of come into themselves. Because reading is mostly up here in the head, and it invokes the feeling life, of course, but it's not really about being in our limbs. And this process of really feeling ourselves in ourselves, not escaping from ourselves, but feeling ourselves in ourselves, it does come through limb movement. So gently encouraging and putting a boundary on the reading, I think that could be a healthy thing. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll be working on that one too. Okay. So here are a couple more. We're at 6:01, so we have 9 minutes. Okay. Let me see here. Okay, so we have a 2.5-year-old who's been a great self-soother and used to fall asleep and stay asleep. And all of a sudden she's waking up, she doesn't want to be in her bed, and, you know, why has this changed? And any tips to getting it back? And I think I heard you address this a little bit, like when they're asking for more, they need another sort of independent step or something. I don't know. I mean, I heard that.
Yeah.
What else? What's going on?
So
2.5-year-old.
there are a lot of these stages. There's one at 2.5 to 3. I don't know what that represents precisely, but that a lot of children become a little bit more awake about what's going on around them. It mirrors in some way the wakefulness that comes with adolescence, where suddenly you realize that there are all kinds of social dynamics that have or that can be at play that you weren't really aware of before. We could say that that consciousness, that attention bubble just got a lot bigger in adolescence. And so that can be a time when you are super connected to your peers, you have a best friend, better than you've ever had, but you can also feel more isolated and alone than you ever have before. There is something about 2.5 to 3 which mirrors that on some level. It's not so much about outside social sensing as just feeling that I am a little bit separate. And so I think it's really common for kids at that time. I mean, I'll also say this is the age when a lot of children become able to sense when they need to go to the bathroom and can really start potty training. Potty training is an experience in my body of feeling where I am and where the outside world begins. So we've just built a boundary where before I couldn't feel that there was really a difference between me and outside. It just overflowed. Now I can feel that, and there's something about the child's sense of self that also takes a step here. So I think it's a really good opportunity to do really reassuring, nice, comforting with the child, spending extra time together, maybe doing some more of this touch. Really, if you've never done something like the toothpaste treatment, I would highly recommend it. It's a really nice thing. That could be a great thing to bring into the bedtime ritual. So I think you can bring some encouragement in terms of saying, I'm really here, but also feel that you don't need to solve the whole process because the child is probably making this step of greater awareness and a little bit restless, trying to find their way into how they live in it. But they will. They will.
Great.
So a little extra on this pathway. Yeah.
Okay, good. So now we have a 12-year-old question. So we'll go from the 2.5-year-old to the 12-year-old from Nancy. She's saying she has a 12-year-old and she's having sleeping problems. So she's kind of walking around, looking. She walks around, she looks for a toothbrush, her pajamas. She's just sort of, trying to put it off, going to bed. But she feels too big for massage or wrestling. Is there something else you can do for a kid that's kind of older here, the 12-year-old, to help with this sleep?
Yeah, so at this point, I think it becomes trying to build some, still to build some framework around bedtime and what should be the progression. Often when somebody is getting to be 12, bedtime can take an hour, or the job of helping them get ready for bed happens, and then they're still reading or they're listening to music or things like that. I think you can put parameters in terms of now it's time to get ready for bed, and this is a time when there needs to be lights out. This is just this correlation we were speaking of about 2.5 to 3 in the beginning of adolescence, that when that pubertal shift happens in terms of social sensing, a lot of this sensing about self-orientation also gets thrown off. Young teenagers, early adolescents don't necessarily know when they're tired anymore, when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, when it's enough. So I think you can build some boundaries around toothbrushing should be at 8:30, lights could be at 9. I don't know, it depends on your 12-year-old. There are some 12-year-olds who are still really happy with that kind of a rhythm. And that you give a few points, but I wouldn't try to manage all of them. You're just, instead of you doing 95% of bedtime, now you're doing 25%. Now it's time to get ready. Now it's time for lights out. And you're helping them explore how they can soothe themselves. Probably keeping them away from screens is really important. In fact, this is true for everybody, and it's becoming part of the regular sleep literature, is that looking at a screen in the hour or two before you go to sleep has an activating activity on our central nervous system. And you just don't go into the same place of deeper relaxation if you've been looking at a screen for sure in the hour before you go to sleep. So 23%.
25%, okay. And then last question we've got here, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to get all of these. There's so many great questions. But I hope maybe we'll do a follow-up sometime. Can you talk about thumb sucking and what's happening and what's that soothing gesture there? And is there anything that you can do to sort of wean them from the thumb sucking? And that's from Dana.
Sure. So thumb sucking is, it's connected to breastfeeding. It's very innate. I've sat in meetings with adults where we're talking about thumb sucking and had everybody suck their thumb. And there are always some people in the group who say, that's kind of nice. I haven't done that in 35 years, but that's kind of, I can feel how that is soothing. And so thumb sucking is sort of around the sense of taste and around the sense of touch. Although it's not taste like the taste of milk. It's very common when children are nervous or going to sleep that they will pop their hand in their mouth. I think it depends on the age of the child. If you have somebody in the first couple of years who's thumb sucking and that's their way to self-orient, and they're able to be in bed and practice this process of self-soothing, I wouldn't worry about it very much. If you're getting a child who is in, let's say 4 and 5, then I think you can be encouraging someone that they don't need to be doing that quite so much. Sometimes it's a pattern which is not even that conscious. I would say probably one of the best things, and this is a tricky balance, is to try to find a way to encourage the child to take a step. If you have a child who's 6 or 7, you could even say, gosh, you must be nervous because I can see the thumb is in your mouth. But let's figure out other ways for you to feel better when you're not, or when you're nervous. There are ways to encourage the child without shaming them, because if that's the child's go-to thing when they are feeling calm, when they are not feeling calm, when they are needing to feel calm, if that's the child's go-to when they're feeling disoriented or overwhelmed, then a shaming or a confrontation can make that actually worse. So I might say, if it's an older child, then to say, let me give you a hand massage. let's pull that thumb out, and building on this fact that the child is experiencing touch as a way to soothe themselves, try to make it an experience of touch which is not related to taste. That's one way that this progression can be helpful, is to say, all right, what does the child really need? And how can I use that same sense experience and just make it a little more mature and a little more independent? So that would be one way, is to say, maybe I can give this child strong, deep touch as another way, another tool for them to feel at home. Good. I think we're at our time. I have one more slide that Laura encouraged me to put a few things up. If you're interested about anthroposophic medicine, which is trying to work with these mysteries, this is the website for the Physicians Association, which I'm a board member of, and I do training for all kinds of people who are licensed prescribers. So medical doctors, osteopaths, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, and naturopathic doctors. There are active training programs that we do. There is also AMTA, which is the Association for all of the different anthroposophic therapies, where you can find out about nursing, massage, eurythmy, singing therapy, art therapy, music therapy. And then some people are curious about me. And if you like these ideas, I put out a little monthly 3-paragraph newsletter. Right now we're talking about cancer and diet, which is quite different from sleep. But you're invited to take a look at that. So I think,
well,
just go back to that picture. Good.
Thank you so much, Adam. We're so glad you're on the call with us. I know all of us are thinking, okay, what are we going to do tonight for our kids? So some of you, I'm on the West Coast and mine are still awake. So thank you again. That was really wonderful. Humor and knowledge all together, one package. Thank you so much for bringing this to us. It's just really wonderful. And thank you all for being on the line from all over the country and Canada and Mexico, and so many wonderful questions. Thank you again. And we look forward to connecting with you. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.